This is an NBC News special report. Here's Craig Melvin.
We are coming on the air this morning with some breaking news. President Trump's former longtime personal attorney, Michael Cohen, admitting he made false statements to Congress about the Russia investigation. Cohen pleading guilty just moments ago during a surprise appearance in federal court here in New York. NBC's Tom Winter was inside that courtroom. He joins me now on the phone. Tom, what more can you tell us?
Craig, I just left where Michael Cohen, dressed in a Navy suit and a white shirt, allocuted and pled guilty to a single count, as you said, of making a false statement to the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. Those false statements regarded the Moscow project. I believe that is the project that involves a possible hotel to be built in Moscow. Michael Cohen told the court that he made false statements about that project, the timing of the project, including statements about possible travel there, although he told the court he did not travel to Moscow. He also said that he made false statements regarding discussions with people in the Trump organization and people in Russia about the project. Craig, in the allocution, Michael Cohen specifically named the president, who will be identified in court papers that we should see momentarily as individual one. He says individual one is Donald J. Trump. He said that his false statements had to do with Russian contacts and with this project. He said that there had been statements made that discussions for the Moscow project ended prior to the Iowa caucuses. He said that is not correct. The discussions for the Moscow project continued into 2017. He additionally said that he took steps to discuss travel to Russia with the president. In addition, Michael Cohen said that he made statements, these statements out of consistent political messaging and out of loyalty to Donald Trump. In addition, he says that in January of 2016, he spoke with somebody in the press secretary's office in the Kremlin. So the first time here that Donald J. Trump's name has been named, the president's name has been named in open court, and this all has to do with the Moscow project. I think one of the major headlines here, Craig, is that discussions about that project continued into 2017. It wasn't specific as to the timing of that, so we don't know whether that was in the transition or after the president had been inaugurated. But today we do learn a little bit more about not only Michael Cohen's statements to Congress, but in addition to that, Michael Cohen's and his involvement in this Moscow project, and that those discussions continued into 2017.
Tom Winter on the phone just out of that courtroom there with Michael Cohen. Tom, thank you. Let's turn now to NBC's justice correspondent, Pete Williams. Pete, let's talk about the potential significance of all of this here, this guilty plea from Michael Cohen just a few moments ago.
Well, the main significance is that now prosecutors will have Michael Cohen's cooperation on two fronts, not just the campaign finance issue that he's already pleaded guilty to, but now this as well. So it's secure. That's, I think, the big significance here. It secures additional cooperation, and that's the sort of thing that you're seeing playing out right now. Now, in terms of what he says he lied about, there was a project to build a large facility in Moscow that would include a hotel, condominiums, perhaps office space, retail space, and that was discussed with the Russians. Cohen told the Senate Intelligence Committee roughly a year ago that the project stopped early in 2016 and there was no further work on it after the Iowa caucuses. That's what he now says. He lied when he said that to Congress. So that's the significance of the charge. Now, politically, President Trump has said during the campaign that he had nothing to do with Russia. So I guess the question is, when he said those words at the time, was the project dead or was it still underway? And that's, I think, a separate question from whether there was Russian meddling in the election. But still, I think that's an important score for the prosecutors to secure his additional cooperation because he was so close to President Trump.
Pete, you correct me if I'm wrong here. Lying to Congress is not a crime that is frequently prosecuted. What, if anything, can we glean from the fact that it's being prosecuted in this particular case?
Well, lying to Congress is not that infrequent. I'm trying to think of the name of the baseball player who was accused of lying to Congress about using steroids. So it does come up from time to time. Lying to the feds in any form is always a charge that the federal government can use to secure somebody's cooperation. They're not saying that Michael Cohen did anything wrong in talking to the Russians or working on this real estate deal. All they're saying is all Cohen is now saying is that when he went before the Senate Intelligence Committee and said work on the project stopped before the presidential campaign got underway in earnest, that was wrong. So that's the sum and substance of it. And the significance of it is additional cooperation. It shows that he's cooperating with the prosecutors, and it's yet more leverage to get his further cooperation. That's the significance of it.
Our Justice correspondent Pete Williams there for us. Pete, thank you.